Today, we re-looking at the XP-67 Moonbat, one of the strangest and most futuristic aircraft of World War II, designed to break boundaries. It never made it past testing. Let's find out why. The XP-67 Moonbat was an experimental fighter and McDonnell Corporation's first serious opportunity to impress the U.S. military establishment, featuring a pioneering morphed fuselage that gave it the appearance of a bat. The XP-67 was trailblazing in both a metaphorical and literal sense. Origins. In July 1939, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation was officially established and looking to make a splash by bagging its first-ever aeronautical contract. Keen to get the ball rolling. Later that year, James McDonnell proactively approached the Army Air Corps to see if they were interested in some of the company's novel fighter designs. Although McDonnell's proposals were rejected for not meeting current Air Corps requirements, his tenacity was rewarded when the Army invited his company to submit blueprints for the request for data. R4OC competition issued in March 1944, a fighter aircraft. The result was the McDonnell Model I proposal, which outlined a fighter powered by either an Allison V342 OB2 or a Pratt & Whitney H3130 that was to be mounted in the fuselage aft of the pilot. The engines were to drive to pusher propellers via extension shafts and an angled gear drive. A rather unconventional layout for its time. Despite not winning, the Air Corps were sufficiently impressed by the inventiveness of the submission to award the young company its first-ever sale in the form of a purchase order worth $3,000 on June 6, 1940. Having piqued the interest of Army officials, McDonnell submitted another proposal in the same month for a two-passenger Model II fighter that was to be propelled by a pair of Continental I-1430s, a more conventional twin-engined arrangement. McDonnell's efforts were again unsuccessful. But following feedback from the Air Corps, it was decided to present a revised version on May 5, 1941 that was renamed Model S-23A. McDonnell envisioned that this radical fighter would principally be used to engage and destroy bomber formations. He also reasoned that the overall efficiency of the craft could be optimized if the fuselage contours were blended into an airfoil shape, thus complementing the wing's lifting abilities and significantly decreasing drag. This time, McDonnell's perseverance and creativeness paid off, and they were granted contract W535AC21218 on August 2, 1941 by the chief of the AAF Experimental Engineering Section, who required them to create two prototypes and to transfer any associated data. The new project would be given the moniker XP-67 by the Army, and by April 15, 1942. After a relatively smooth development period, a full-scale mock-up was available for inspection. The XP-67 was 13.65 meters in length, 4.80 meters in height, had an empty weight of 8,049 kilograms and a maximum weight of 11,521 kilograms. By merging the center fuselage and the rear segments of the engine nacelles in a concerted attempt to maintain true airfoil sections, the XP-67 resembled a bat in appearance and was replete with chiropteran wings with a span of 16.76 meters and an area of 38.46 meters squared. The XP-67 was installed with dual Continental X I-143O turbo-supercharged 12-cylinder inverted V liquid-cooled engines, which were placed inside lengthy engine nacelles, which in turn drove a pair of four-bladed propellers rotating in opposite directions. Interestingly, the exhaust at the back also doubled up as an extra source of thrust. Further adding to the mix were thrust augmenters installed in the engines, which were able to squeeze out some extra velocity from the engine gases after they had passed through the turbo-supercharger. Another innovation that was planned but never implemented involved a novel use of the XP-67's turbo-superchargers via these mechanisms. On takeoff, the engines were to emit 1,300 horsepower of thrust, which would change to 1,600 horsepower once the plane had reached an altitude of 7,620 meters. Performance-wise, the XP-267, which could soar to a maximum altitude of 11,400 meters, had a top speed of 652 kilometers per hour, a cruising speed of 435 kilometers per hour, a rate of climb of 13 meters per second, and a combat range of 2,384 miles. The production version of the XP-67 was anticipated to have a significant arsenal of weapons. The first proposed layout comprised 6 0.50-inch machine guns and 4 20mm cannons. A later specification revised this, and instead opted for 6 37mm cannons with 45 rounds each in the wing sections. Towards the end, a massive 75mm gun installation was even considered. But like the production edition of the XP-67, this would never come to fruition. The Continental X I-143O inverted V-12 This engine is often said to be the source of the XP-67's problems, but it was actually the airframe around it that was at fault. Furthermore, a handful of planned features, including a pressurized cabin, an oxygen system, and a set of drooping ailerons, were also never added to the single XP-67 prototype. Neither were a ream of additional components and layouts that were to be potentially installed on the second prototype and production model. Here, engineers toyed with substituting the contra-rotating propellers for handed propellers, and also considered using a mixed power plant arrangement in which the front of each nacelle would house either a Packard V1650 or Allison V1710 inline engine with a 2-speed supercharger. Both were to be augmented by an I-20 turbojet. Flight tests, which was complemented by a smidgen of green dappling around the leading and trailing edges of the flying surfaces. The XP-67 first undertook a battery of high-speed taxi tests at Lambert Field, where it was slightly damaged after one of the turbo supercharger units cracked and became engulfed in fire, burning the interior of the engine nacelle. It was an incident that would set the tone for upcoming trials, foreshadowing many later disasters. What made this all the more dangerous was that since they were buried deep within the nacelle, the blaze would not be noticed by the pilot until the exterior paint began to smoke and blister. Nevertheless, repaired on December 8, 1942, it was next transferred to Scott Field in Illinois, where it was prepared for its first flight, set to take place on January 6, 1944. That day, with test pilot E. E. Elliott at the controls, the XP-67 performed a 6-minute flight, starting with a brief circuit of the test field, but ending with an emergency landing due to faulty turbo compartments. In response, they were encased in stainless steel firewalls to prevent fire spreading. Precautions having now put in place, a second and third trial were completed without a hitch. But trouble was brewing on the horizon once again. On February 1, 1942, a routine test flight suddenly went awry after the XP-67's engine bearings were completely burnt away due to power plant complications. Sent back to the McDonnell plant in St. Louis, the cooling ducts were completely remodeled, while the horizontal tail surfaces were raised 30.5 centimeters in order to improve longitudinal stability characteristics. Moreover, with the engines completely wrecked, Continental were forced to supply the XP-67 with replacements while the original propulsion system was being fixed. But when testing was resumed in March, the new power plants were found to be substandard, immediately putting a halt to proceedings. Flight evaluations, now conducted by Army Air Corps pilots, were finally restarted on May 11, 1944, after which a further spate of problems, such as engine roughness, improper aileron balance, and faulty main undercarriage door closure were identified and corrected over several months. It was during this period also that the XP-67's difficult handling characteristics were fixed with the addition of small dorsal fin and an increase of the angle of tailplane dihedral from 5 degrees to 7 degrees. On the other hand, issues with the engines unfortunately persisted, reaching an unexpected and ruinous climax on September 6, 1944, after the XP-67 had clocked up a total of 43 hours flight time. It was on this date that XP-67 prototype was damaged beyond repair after a fire engulfed the right nacelle mid-flight, forcing Elliott to make an emergency landing. Upon touchdown, gusts of wind started to blow the fire over the fuselage, causing even further destruction. It must be noted, however, that the experimental engines were not actually the source of the problems. It was due to the airframe improperly catering to them, with flight trials only 15% completed. On September 13, 1944, at a meeting of Air Corps and McDonnell representatives, it was advised that the entire project should be cancelled. An opinion also motivated in part by the fact that by 1944, the need for a bomber-destroyer was virtually non-existent. 6 weeks later, a formal termination notice was issued, meaning the near-complete second prototype was also scrapped. However, although McDonnell's earliest foray into fighter planes had been a failure, success would soon come with the development of the FD-1 Phantom, the U.S. Navy's first jet fighter, a craft that would fully cement the company's reputation as a titan of industry.